Hello, and welcome back to our search for the best storyteller in Are You Afraid of the Dark? In this one, we'll be diving into Season 2, so if you haven't seen the previous video, then I highly recommend you give it a watch. We will be using scores discussed in Season 1 to determine some averages a little bit later on, and I do a lot of comparisons here and there between some of the episodes. Not to mention, there are some fantastic and scary stories in Season 1, so it would be a shame if you missed out on those. And with that said, let's talk about the second season. The concept of the show remains the same. A group of friends get together and take turns telling each other scary stories. But with this season, there's one change to the Midnight Society. Eric is no longer in the show, and he isn't replaced with any newcomers, so our group of 7 has now become a group of 6. It's kind of funny, because he told the highest scoring story of last season, basically just dropping the best episode and then dipping out. He's got a pretty great legacy at this point. But otherwise, the Midnight Society is the same. We've still got Gary, the leader, with his magical horror stories, Kristen with her very romantic and fantasy-based horror stories, Betty Ann with her bizarre and overall twisted stories, Kiki, who actually gets more than one story this season and tells tales of deceit and carelessness, David with his very humanizing stories with themes of traumatic past events, and Frank, who also gets more than one story this season and shares tales of classic horror. With as much as I loved Season 1, I was surprised to find that I enjoyed Season 2 even more. This season took all of the momentum from the first and just rolled with it, giving us stories that are scary and unique and weird. I think this season has some of the most memorable and quoted moments in the entire series. The stories of the Frozen Ghost and the Shiny Red Bicycle are 2 of the top episodes that I've gotten comments about, so I know that a lot of you remember this season fondly as well. So, with that being said, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video, and submitted for the approval of the Midnight Society, I asked the question, who tells the best scary story in Are You Afraid of the Dark? Season 2. To start off the season, Kristen is our first storyteller. From the previous season, we've seen that she tends to tell really good and intricate stories, but while the stories are great, her scares are a little bit underwhelming. So let's see if she's kept up that trend. This episode is called The Tale of the Final Wish, and at first it seems like the moral of the story is that kids should grow up and leave behind things that are seen as childish, but that's not what the true moral ends up being. It's more of a story of allowing yourself to grow up while keeping your childlike wonder intact. Kind of like having to deal with taxes and a full-time job, while at the same time getting on the internet and ranting and raving about a 30-year-old Nickelodeon television show. Let's just say, I really took this moral to heart. The episode is about a girl named Jill who's 13 years old but is still obsessed with fairy tales and some toys that she grew up with. While her friends are starting to find interest in boys, Jill seems content with reading her fairy tales and living through the fantasies that they describe. This has caused her friends to start to bully her and has earned her grief from both of her parents and her older brother. And speaking of her older brother, he's a little bit of a prankster in this episode. He knows that Jill is a little scaredy cat and he takes the chance to scare her whenever he can.
Oh, Jill, it's me. Why did you do that?
Gotcha.
It was you? Mom! Come on, don't be such a snitch. I hate you! Why did you do that?
Before we get into the main chunk of this story, we've already got to visit the closet of tragic 90s fashion. If you're new here, just know that this show came out in the 90s, a time when fashion meant both nothing and everything all at once. This episode isn't too extreme in the fashion area, but there is a boy with a tie that looks like tie-dye mixed with vomit, and Jill wears this floral printed coat that reminds me of my grandma's couch. So 2 new additions already, and we're only in episode 1. Wanting everyone to get off of her back, one night Jill clutches a book of fairy tales and wishes that everyone would just leave her alone. She goes to sleep, but wakes up a little bit later to find that everyone in the house has vanished. Then she notices the draping around her bed is moving, so someone must be under there. Assuming it's her older brother again, she lifts the drapes, only to find out It's freaking Bobcat Goldthwait. Now listen, I love this guy. He's hands down my favorite part of the episode, and if you've never experienced Bobcat before, then oh boy, you are in for a treat. The way he talks is as if he's constantly in pain and trying his best not to yell, but failing at that entirely. I think my favorite role of his is in Police Academy. I want to say, like, I'm pretty sure it's Police Academy 2, but it might be 3. It's just when he busts into the grocery store and basically just screams the whole time while robbing the place. Man, it's wonderful. Anyway, he's in this now, and he plays a screaming and scary Sandman.
John? Come out, will you? You are such a slime. If you think that you're gonna scare me again...
Jill tries to run away, but gets sucked beneath her bed and transported into a world of fairy tales. The scene of her getting transported is so fun and so weird. It looks great, and she finds herself in a room full of ticking clock parts and these images of the backs of people's heads stretching into the distance. It's both really cool and pretty freaky at the same time. In fact, this whole dimension is that way. Each room is bizarre, seeming ethereal and dreamlike, with fun camera angles through moving cogs and foggy floors with no true sense of scale. The music here is also incredible. It captures that ethereal and dreamy feeling so perfectly as Jill explores this new dimension. She walks through a few rooms to find sleeping people all floating in never-ending dream states, until finally she finds the room of the Sandman and is able to get some answers on what exactly is going on.
This is a dream. I've got to be dreaming.
You're getting warmer, but you're only half right. This place is a dream, but you're not dreaming.
And who are you?
Isn't it obvious? I'm the Sandman. And this is my home.
He reveals that her being brought here was his way of granting her wish, so now she can be left alone to explore her fairy tales without anyone ever bothering her. Her family and her friends, and I think also everyone else in the entire world as well, have been put into dreams and will be trapped here forever. But hey, at least Jill will be alone, right? Of course, this isn't what Jill wanted. She tries to run away, but finds herself moving in slow motion, capturing that feeling of running in a dream so well as she can't get away from the nightmare that she's found herself in. She tries a few doors to escape, but each door just leads into another fairy tale, the first showing her the Queen of Hearts from Alice in Wonderland. And the next opening to the evil witch from Hansel and Gretel. Clearly, there's no escape, and eventually Jill goes back to the Sandman and begs him to release her from this world. The kid who played Jill does an amazing job here. I think she's actually crying, but even if they're fake tears, the despair feels genuine. She really wants to leave, to return to the world and release everyone from their eternal sleeps. When begging doesn't work, she immediately turns to threats. She grabs the Sandman's hourglass and threatens to break it if she isn't released from the dream. The Sandman tries to rationalize with her, but it's no use, and when he doesn't do as she asks, Jill throws the hourglass to the ground, and it shatters. With that, everyone is finally released from the world of dreams, and Jill finds herself waking up screaming from that awful nightmare. Her parents run in to comfort her, and Jill agrees to give up on some of her fairy tales, but her mother tells her not to stop being a kid, just to also be okay with growing up. The episode ends with one final word from Bobcat.
The little girl went back to sleep, promising never to believe in fairy tales again. If only she knew, she would have never gone back in that bed again.
The end.
I'll admit, Season 2 is starting off so strong. This has become one of my favorite episodes so far. It's a little bit spooky, but it's also just really weird, and you can tell they went all out with the set designs and the music, and just in general this entire story. The story has a great moral, but also it's incredibly unique. Jill being sucked into the world of dreams with the Sandman antagonist was so bizarre, and it kept me interested the entire time. Also, her running through the dream world and encountering other fairy tales while also discovering her friends and family were trapped in their dreams was really cool. For the story, I'm going to give this one an 8 out of 10. Now, the real question for a Kristen story is, how scary was it? This one had a few good scares. The brothers' pranks were decent for jumps, the Sandman is a creepy character, the sets are really spooky, and the idea of never-ending dreams is pretty horrifying. That being said, this episode was clearly not focused on horror, and I think all of the scary moments end up building together to make a middle-of-the-line 5 out of 10. But as you can probably tell, I really loved this episode, and the bonus points are going to reflect that. Our first point goes to the music. While in the dream world, it was really atmospheric, and when visiting each of the other fairy tales, it mixed up a little bit to capture the vibe of those stories. Another point will go to the sets. In fact, they were so impressive that 2 points will be going to the sets. Everything in the dream world looked incredible, and while a little bit dated, the effect of Jill being sucked into the dream world was really fun and stylistic. A 4th point is going to Jill, because I think she's the best kid actor that we've seen in the entire series so far. She's top tier, her crying scene alone deserves this bonus point. And I think nobody is going to be surprised by this, I have to give a final bonus point to our man Bobcat. I love him so much, and he killed it in this episode. He made me laugh, he was a little bit creepy, and he looks the part of a being that is constantly in a state of exhaustion. So, for the very first time in the entire series, and in the first episode of Season 2, we've got our first perfect 5 out of 5 bonus point score, which will leave the Tale of the Final Wish with a total score of 18 out of 25, which starts off Season 2 on an incredibly high note. Episode 2 is a little bit of a special occasion, because finally, after a full season, Frank gets to tell his second story. He hasn't been in the storyteller chair since the very first episode, so let's see what he's got with the Tale of the Midnight Madness. The opening shots show us a theater, and the movie playing here is something called The Bostics of Beacon Hill. Now, I only mention this because I'm pretty sure that this is a reference to Betty Ann's story from last season called The Tale of the Twisted Claw. In that one, Kevin, you might remember him for killing his friend's parents via a wish, also wished to win a race, and it ended up being granted by breaking an older boy named Bostic's leg. I did a little bit of research, like a whole 3 minutes of Google researching to be precise, and it doesn't seem like there's an actual movie called The Bostics of Beacon Hill, or any other media that shares in that name. So I'm calling it, this is a reference to the Tale of the Twisted Claw. Now, this is an old-timey theater, the kind of place that you go to experience some classic movies still shown on a film projector, but as it's fallen behind the times, it's starting to go under. Our main characters Pete and Katie work at the theater, and Pete tries everything that he can in order to keep the theater open. He's doing his best because he loves the theater and everything film, but he's also doing it because he is one of the most desperately thirsty characters that's ever been written. Every scene between him and Katie basically just boils down to Pete trying to ask her out and tell her how much he likes her over and over. And there's this one part, like, I actually cringed when he asks for a repeat hug in this one scene.
Let's hug again!
Man, Pete, he's just down so bad. The manager of the theater is named Mr. Kristoff, and he informs Pete and Katie that the theater owners are officially selling it, so they've only got a few weeks before they'll be out of a job. Fortunately for them, there's a knock on the door, and a man with a possible solution shows up just in time. And this man is none other than Dr. Fink.
Dr. Fink?
Vink with a V.
It turns out that Dr. Vink has moved from his study of flora and fauna and has found a passion in filmmaking. He promises the manager that the theater will start to show success if the manager agrees to show off one of Vink's films. In exchange for his promised success, Vink and the manager make a deal which will allow Vink to show his films on one night every week.
I've come to save your theater. And it won't cost you a dime. And I am not a nutbag.
Vink then vanishes, leaving behind an old film and leaving the trio with nothing but questions. Pete puts on the film one night, and we see that apparently in this universe, Dr. Vink was the man behind Nosferatu. Despite it being a black and white silent film, the audience seems to love it. They exit the theater with high praise and promise to come back again and spread the word of this wonderful place to watch movies. We then jump ahead a couple of weeks, and now the theater is incredibly successful. Obviously it wasn't sold off, as the owners decided to hold off on closing the place down since now it's making some good money. But with this success, we see the return of Dr. Vink. His promise was fulfilled, so now he's come for his end of the bargain. But Mr. Kristoff isn't holding up his end of the deal. With this success, there just isn't room in the schedule to give Vink a full day for his films alone.
One shouldn't make a bargain if they can't honor their commitments.
Kristoff tries to offer money for compensation, but Vink wants only what he was promised, and when he doesn't get it, he leaves with a few cryptic words.
That's where you're wrong, my friend. This story is far, far from over. In fact, it's only just beginning.
That night, Pete is watching Nosferatu alone, trying to study it and figure out what makes it so special. But he's also tired, and just as he's falling asleep, he thinks that he sees the vampire exit the screen. He wakes up a little bit later when he hears Mr. Kristoff suddenly scream. When he and Katie investigate, they find Kristoff face down on his desk with a bite mark on his neck. They rush out of the office to try and find help, but when they get to the front door, they're stopped by the pale vampire himself.
Nosferatu!
Everything with Nosferatu is pretty creepy and decently well done. There's a lot of classic horror moments in clear homage to the original film, and the costume and performance of Nosferatu were really scary. After being chased through the theater, Pete has a eureka moment and has Katie put the film on the projector. He then runs onto the stage and enters the movie. Nosferatu chases him inside, but Pete has seen this movie a dozen times already, so he knows the best way to beat the vampire. He pulls the curtains from the window and blasts the vamp with sunlight, which turns it to dust. Pete then exits only to find Vink is sitting in the audience with a bucket of popcorn and having the time of his life. Kristoff comes out a second later and tells Vink that he feels bad for going back on the deal, and now he wants to honor it. But Vink says that's no longer necessary because he contacted the owners and he bought the entire theater.
I've just purchased this theater.
You what?
Oh, yes. Now I can show my films every night. And believe me, I've got many, many more that are far better than this one.
The end.
If I'm honest, I'm a little bit mixed on this episode. I thought that it was okay, but I feel like I should like it more than I do. I think the setting of the theater got a little bit stale, kind of like the popcorn they're eating, ayo! And whenever Vink or the vampire weren't on screen, things weren't that interesting. But I do love the idea of haunted movies, and then using Nosferatu was pretty fun and spooky. Also, Vink making his second official appearance was a real treat, so I'm thinking that this story is going to be a 6 out of 10. The scares weren't super high in this one either, but it did have some good scary moments. Like I mentioned, everything with Nosferatu was pretty creepy, and him chasing Pete and Katie through the theater was really intense. But when the vamp wasn't on screen, the scares didn't exist. So I think this is another slightly above the midline 6 out of 10. For a few bonus points, you know we're giving one to Vink. Every time he shows up, every scene he's in is a real treat. I just love how chaotic and maniacal he is. I'll give another for Nosferatu. He was also pretty great. He looked great. He was creepy. He was all around one of the best monsters that we've seen in the entire series so far, so he'll definitely get a point. And I think that's it. So 2 out of 5 bonus points, which gives Frank's second story, The Tale of the Midnight Madness, a total score of 14 out of 25. Episode 3 is already another Kristen story. This time she comes walking into camp wearing her parents' old hippie clothes, so we can assume that this episode is going to be real groovy. And it's called The Tale of Locker 22. We follow a girl named Julie who has just transferred to this school from France, and things are immediately not going well. She gets bullied super hard right out the gate. In chemistry class, she accidentally breaks a beaker, and her teacher is he's so dumb with his response.
Don't do that.
Yeah, no duh, don't do that. Like, what a strange response. Like, if it was on purpose, you'd think that he'd be mad, but if he thought it was an accident, then I guess he should ask her to just clean it up or be careful. But instead he's just like, nah, you shouldn't break beakers. Like, freaking Teacher of the Year award right here. And speaking of great teachers, when Julie comes to the school, we meet the assistant principal named Mr. Schaffner. He assigns Julie to locker number 22, but he's kind of just a curmudgeon and he clearly hates his job.
I've been here far too long to take grief from a transfer who's only been here 5 minutes.
I'm sorry. This will be fine.
Since Julie broke the beaker, some bullies have targeted her and they're just so over the top. They sit next to her and just start smack-talking her before trying to spray her with milk, which ends up evolving into a full-on food fight because she ducks out of it. These bullies aren't really important to the story, but because of them, Julie does get introduced to her only friend, a boy named Chris. He's introduced wearing a shirt that looks like every color of the booger rainbow, striped in weirdly non-even patterns. It's an ugly one. So Julie has noticed this strangely dressed quiet girl that just seems to pop up at random times. She never says a word, and once Julie asks her what she wants, the girl just vanishes right before her eyes. So we're working with a full-on ghost here. One day, a bead necklace falls from Julie's locker, and the ghost girl motions for Julie to put it on. But when she does, she's somehow transported back in time to the 60s. I love this jump back in time. All the characters are using cool 60s lingo and dressed in hippie outfits and tie-dye, and then there's this dude that just looks like he's absolutely stoned out of his gourd. Everyone seems to think that Julie is Candy.
Candy, those beats are so far out.
What did you call me?
And when she looks at her locker, she sees Candy's name is on it, so this is why the ghost has clung to her. Julie takes the beads off and appears back to the present day. She then goes to Chris to tell him what she's discovered, and obviously he doesn't believe her, so she puts the beads back on and transports both of them back to the 60s. This time we see a younger version of Mr. Schaffner. He tells Julie/Candy that she's got to make up her chemistry project today after school or she'll have to do summer school. This is important for a little bit later on, but for now, Julie takes the beads off again and she and Chris return to the present day with questions on their mind. Specifically, what's the deal with Candy? That's my Jerry Seinfeld. They track down an old yearbook and see that Candy seemed to have died in the same year that they keep transporting back to, but there's no information on how she died. So they split up to search for answers, and Julie ends up putting the beads back on, only to get in trouble with the young Mr. Schaffner and being forced into the chemistry lab to complete her missing project. At this same time, Chris tracks down another teacher and he's able to ask him about Candy. It turns out that she died in the chemistry lab in some kind of fiery explosion. So Chris tracks down Julie, only to realize that she must have gone back to the past, which means that she could be in danger of dying in Candy's place. We do get a close-up on a frayed gas line as Julie's trying to light her burner, but fortunately, she's completely hopeless for some reason at lighting a match. She just struggles so hard, but hey, the struggle ends up saving her life, I guess, so that's good. Chris is able to contact the Candy Ghost, who sends him back in time to go and rescue Julie. He then rushes to the chemistry lab just in time to stop Julie from lighting the burner with a candle that she had to walk off screen to go get pre-lit. And then it's pretty funny because Chris then takes that faulty line and he shoves it in Mr. Schaffner's face, and he yells at him that he's incompetent and he's clearly in the long line of work.
Thank God you saw this. If you hadn't...
I would have been toast.
And now, with a life saved, Julie and Chris return to the present. Only things are a little bit different now. They're stopped by a teacher who turns out to be the current assistant principal. Yeah, Mr. Schaffner took Chris's words to heart, so he's no longer a teacher in this timeline. But Candy is alive, and she's taken his place.
I'm the assistant principal, Ms. Warren. Candy Warren.
They saved her life and altered the timeline, and that's where we end the story. I've said it before, and I'm sure that I'll say it again. Kristen's stories are always unique and very intricate. This one, having a plot of changing the course of time to save a life, was really interesting. It did remind me a little bit of The Tale of the Lonely Ghost, where the ghost is a little bit scary at first, but ends up only wanting help from the main character. The present day stuff was a little bit unnecessary all around. It seemed like it was mostly pure filler in most cases, and the only character other than Julie and Chris that ended up mattering was Mr. Schaffner. Kind of. So the whole subplot of Julie being bullied, it was sort of just there. But the main plot of the episode was really cool, and jumping back and forth through time was pretty fluidly done. I'm thinking the story will get a 7 out of 10. That being said, in classic Kristen fashion, this episode was way light on the scares. In fact, the scares, they hardly existed at all. Mostly the spooky factor relied on the ghost of Candy, but even before we knew that she only wanted help, she didn't really look scary or malicious. She kind of just looked like she was scared and maybe a little bit mopey. Her vanishing is a little bit spooky, but man, I'm struggling to even think of this one as a scary story. I think it's gonna get a 2 out of 10 for the scares. For a few bonus points, I do think that this episode did time travel really well, and it's cool that they leaned into the present being changed due to their actions, so we'll give a point there. And another is going to all the 60s fashion and lingo. It's groovy, and I think that's really all that needs to be said about that. So 2 out of 5 bonus points, which leaves the tale of Locker 22 at a total of 11 out of 25. Which, it's not the best score, but it still was a good episode. Betty Ann takes the stage for episode 4, and let me tell you, I'm ready to be scared. This one is called The Tale of the 13th Floor, and 13 is a scary number, so that means we're off to a good start, right? This episode stars a girl named Karen and her brother Billy, who's freaking Iceman from X-Men. He's also in other stuff, but he'll always be Iceman to me. Da-na-na-na-na. X-Men theme song, and maybe Iceman little thing edit here. Dino. Da-na-na-na-na. Dino. Da-na-na-na-na. Billy and Karen like to play on the 13th floor of their apartment complex because the whole floor is vacant. Billy also seems to be much better than Karen at pretty much everything. Something that she constantly points out, and something that she blames on her genes since she was adopted.
I think the net's right there. I know that. If I had your genes, I could do it.
What have my genes got to do with it?
Not your blue genes, Zipperhead, your biological genes. My real parents must have been collectors like me.
Will you get off of that? You can't use your adoption as an excuse every time you can't do something.
Why not? It's very convenient.
A purplish light shines outside, and the whole floor starts to shake, so Karen and Billy decide it's time to go home. But when they try the elevator, they meet a new elevator operator named Leonid. And, I mean, he's a really big weirdo, so they decide to just take the stairs, which I think is a good call. In the night, Karen's TV turns on by itself, and over the static, a man begins to talk to her.
Are you talking to me?
What do you think?
I think I'm dreaming.
Then, in the morning, Billy and Karen try to go to the 13th floor, but they learn that new tenants have moved in. Karen receives an invitation from the tenants of that floor to come and test the toys that they've been making, since apparently the floor is now a complete toy factory. Even though Billy isn't invited, Karen decides to take him with her to go and test out the toys because they're siblings and they do things together. When they get to the 13th floor, they see that it has completely transformed, and I love this whole set. The pastel colors, the conveyor belt of weird toys, the little mascot toy men, the dice Roomba, it's so fun and so weird. A woman named Olga greets the kids and brings them to the back where the toy testing will begin. In the back room, there's even more fun things to look at. There's weird machines with squishy purple buttons and letter blocks all over the place. This place, it just gets better, and I love it. The toy technician is another weirdo named Raymond, and he directs the kids to their first toy that they'll be testing, which is a game that tests their reflexes. At first, Billy is constantly beating Karen, as usual, but then Raymond starts to turn a valve on the wall, and as he does, Billy gets slower while Karen starts to excel. And it's so funny, like, as Billy starts to lose, he just gets so down on himself and he kind of gets pathetic, and it made me laugh.
Wait, I'll get it.
While Billy keeps trying his toy, Karen is brought to another machine, and Raymond says that this one will unlock parts of her brain that have been dormant since her birth. He instructs her on what to do, and quickly, Karen unlocks an innate ability of telekinesis. That's right, we've got Iceman, and now we've got Jean Grey in this family. The team's all coming together. Raymond goes back to the valve and puts it even higher, saying something about how he's manipulating the atmosphere to more resemble his home. Then he takes off his face and reveals his terrifying truth.
Once you have reached your median capacity, we will transfer you to the ship.
What ship? I'm not going in any ship!
That's better.
Raymond flips some switches and a hatch in the ceiling opens, revealing even more aliens and causing the seat that Karen's in to lift upwards. But remember, Karen's got powers now, so she won't go so easily. She uses her telekinesis to unflip the switch and releases herself from the chair. She also kicks Raymond, and we learn that not only is he an alien, he's also a robot, and her kick caused him to freeze up. Also, his controller is one of those old, Tiger Electronics handheld games. I don't know which one, I couldn't find it on a search, so if you know, then let me know down in the comments, because I'm kind of curious, what game could possibly control robotic aliens? Karen ends up hiding an event just as Olga shows up to find out what the commotion is all about. She unfreezes Raymond, who quickly refines Karen, and he sticks his head inside of the vent next to her, which acts as both a jump scare and also it's just pretty funny looking. So Karen runs through the vent, but before she can escape, she's stopped by Leonid, who unfortunately is not a robot, but he is still an alien.
It's time to expand your horizons. See another side of the universe.
Karen runs away again and ends up in the room with Billy. She helps him, but as they make their way to the door, they're stopped again by Olga and Raymond. But this time, Karen has Raymond's controller. She uses it to command Raymond to hold Olga. And just look at this dude's creepy smile. It's so off-putting and weird. It just added to the bizarre nature of everything that's going on in this episode. Karen and Billy make their way to the elevator as Leonid tries one more time to convince Karen to stay with them. He doesn't try to stop the kids, however. He just tells her that he wishes she would change her mind and come with them because the place that they want to go is where Karen truly belongs. But Karen doesn't go for it. She and Billy return to their apartment just in time to see the lights of the ship blast back into the sky. Then Karen's TV turns on again, and this time, Olga begins to talk with her. She says that years ago, the aliens accidentally left one of their young on Earth, and they were trying to rescue her this whole time. Olga's face disappears, and as we look back at the kids, we see that Karen's has as well, which scares Billy and reveals to us that Karen was a long-lost alien child this whole time. What a great episode. I love how weird and how cool and how fun and kind of scary everything is in this one. The aliens are so creepy, but their human counterparts are also just beyond strange. It's both kind of funny and off-putting at the same time. The story of some kids wandering into an alien trap disguised as a toy factory made for such a good time, and it did a good job of slowly revealing exactly what was going on at different parts of the episode. First, we think that it's a toy factory, then we learn it's aliens, then we learn it's a way to unlock Karen's mind powers, only for the twist at the end to show that Karen was an alien this whole time. For the story, I'm giving this one an 8 out of 10. It also had some decent scares. The aliens alone would definitely have given me nightmares as a kid. Their design with no face is off-putting, not to mention the weird nature of their human disguises occasionally peeks into the uncanny valley. It wasn't the most scary thing in the world, but it did also have some pretty intense chase scenes and the very real possibility that Billy could have died at any moment. I'm gonna give it a 7 out of 10 for the scares. It definitely earned some bonus points as well. You know I love a good set, and this one had some of the best that we've seen so far. Not to mention all the really cool machines and toys and big background set pieces. I think that it all comes together, and it deserves 2 bonus points. I'll give another to Raymond. He was weird and fun and uncanny, and just a freaking terrifying alien all at the same time. Definitely one of my favorite parts of this episode. And then a final point will go for that plot twist. There are some decent clues that lead us to believe that Karen could be somewhat related to the weirdos of the 13th floor, but the reveal at the end with her all aliened up is so just spooky and well done, it definitely deserves a point, which means 4 out of 5 bonus points for this one. That leaves the tale of the 13th floor with a total score of 19 out of 25, and like I said, I just loved this one, and I can't wait to see what's next. With episode 5, Kiki finally gets her second story in this series. I know I don't talk about the Midnight Society much, but I have to mention the overarching segments for this episode just a little bit, because it shows that Kiki has laryngitis. She types out her story, and she has Gary read it, so for her second story ever, she doesn't even get to read it. I just thought that it was funny. It won't count for or against this episode at all, but she had to wait so long to be the storyteller, and when her time finally comes, it just ends up going to Gary again. So let's see what Kiki wrote for us in The Tale of the Dream Machine. We meet a kid named Sean who loves to write, and he's also got a crush on a girl named Jennifer. His teacher gives the class an assignment to write a story, and this becomes pretty important later on. But for now, Sean and his best friend Billy head over to his house to hang out after school. As they're going up to Sean's room, Billy falls through the stairs and discovers a secret room from the man who used to live here. The man was an author of horror novels, but he mysteriously vanished one day only to be found murdered 1 year later. The only thing other than some newspaper clippings in this secret room is the author's old typewriter. And as an aspiring writer, Sean takes the typewriter and begins writing a new story on it that night. Before I get too into the story, I have to mention that a little bit later, we see Sean go to bed, and he's got freaking clap lights. This kid's rad already. I always wanted those when I was growing up, but the closest thing that I got was a tap light. Hey, taps and claps, they might rhyme, but they just aren't the same. They just aren't the same. Anyway, Sean's story is called The Halloween Dance, and it's about him getting the nerve to ask Jennifer to dance with him, only for it to later reveal that Sean is a real vampire. When the story ends, we see Jennifer wake up from a nightmare, and the next day at school, she talks to him and ends up telling him about this dream, a dream that Sean realizes is exactly the same as the story that he wrote. He and Billy go back to his place again after school, but Billy is tired and falls asleep, so Sean decides to get to his school paper. He writes another story, this time about Billy being dared to explore a haunted graveyard. Billy gets spooked by a ghost called Blind Paul and is trapped inside of a coffin and buried alive. Once again, Billy wakes up from a nightmare, and as he tells Sean what happened, Sean realizes that it is exactly his story, and now he understands that this typewriter must be behind these coincidences.
It's the typewriter. That's why it was hidden. It's got some kind of power. Is that possible? Could this be a dream machine?
For a final test, that night Sean writes a story of him and Jennifer, talking in heaven, where he reveals that he's been writing her dreams and that he kind of likes her. She tells him that she kind of likes him too, and then they share a kiss. But I've got to mention a few things about this. First off, this is the first on-screen kiss in this series, so that's kind of neat. And to completely take away from this romantic moment, we need to remember that Sean is writing this dream, so Jennifer isn't actually saying any of this. Sean's just writing it. He wrote that his crush had a crush on him, and it worked. It's a bit creepy when you look at it from that perspective, especially because he wrote them having a kiss. I don't know. It's a bit uncomfortable. Anyway, Jennifer calls Sean on his totally awesome motorcycle phone. Dude, he's got such cool stuff. I'm so jealous. I'm an adult now, but I still want this phone, and I still want clap lights. I'm not over the clap lights thing, but this motorcycle phone has unlocked a whole new level of jealousy in me. So now comes a little bit of a twist. Jennifer, Billy, and Sean are all hanging out now, discussing what they could do with the power of the typewriter. And then Billy picks up the story of the Halloween dance and begins to read it. As he does, Sean and Jennifer disappear and find themselves being forced to live the story. Right before the vampire Sean bites Jennifer, Billy stops reading and realizes that his friends have vanished, only for them to reappear right before his eyes. So any story written on the typewriter becomes reality when it's read. This brings us to that school assignment. Sean turned in the story of Billy being trapped in the graveyard, and their teacher is only a few minutes away from reading it and making it a terrifying new reality. I've got to talk about the teacher here for just a second because she's such a blatant caricature. It's crazy. She's a little bit of a bigger lady, and the show writers just leaned on that to an extreme level. She's always eating donuts, and when she's out, she ends up going to the kitchen and grabbing a plate full of cinnamon rolls. Sean and Jennifer are trying to track her down. Meanwhile, Billy's just trapped in the story with Blind Paul. And one of the clues that they find is a cinnamon roll with just one bite taken out of it. So the teacher took a bite and then just left it while taking 2 more cinnamon rolls with her on a plate. And we see probably the scariest thing in any episode so far, when the teacher goes to the bathroom and leaves her plate of sweets on the floor. That's, man, this lady is built different. Sean and Jennifer can't find the teacher anywhere, so Sean comes up with an idea to stop the typewriter by using the typewriter. He types up a story and Jennifer reads it.
Read it. Read it!
The typewriter stopped glowing and all the stories ever written on it never came true.
Welcome back, dude. Yes!
This works perfectly as Billy returns from the story world and the 3 friends share in a laugh. Kiki's second story was a hit. I liked it a lot. I thought it was kind of cool because I realized that this was a way for Kiki to share a few more of her stories that maybe weren't fully fleshed out yet. This episode alone is a little bit of an anthology, giving us a story of a magic typewriter, a vampire at a dance, and a haunted graveyard all at the same time. It was clever and constantly changing, which made the episode move quickly and feel fresh in every single scene. I think the story is a solid 7 out of 10. It was a little bit scary as well, not terrifying, but it had some good spooky moments and some really well done and intense buildups. The vampire scene is a little bit scary, but the real fear is with Billy being trapped. The ghost in the graveyard and the claustrophobia as Billy pounds on the coffin lid were really decent horror moments. So I'm going with a 7 out of 10 for the scares as well. There wasn't a ton that I found for bonus points, but Sean's cool gadgets with the clap lights and the motorcycle phone made me jealous and definitely earned a point for sure. And I do love the way that this episode gave us, like I said, that tiny anthology, so I'll do another point for that, just for the creativity, totaling 2 out of 5 bonus points. So Kiki's second story was really good, a really big improvement from her not very scary first story, and this one gets a total score of 16 out of 25. Episode 6 is told by David, and it's called The Tale of the Dark Dragon. So, twice in a row I'm going to quickly talk about the overarching narrative with the Midnight Society, because it is a little bit important to this story. It's Gary's birthday, and as a surprise, David made a story with magic just for him. And not only that, but he borrowed one of Gary's favorite made-up characters. You probably already know who it is, but if you don't, then I'll save that reveal for the time when it comes up in the episode. Something else that I noticed that I thought was really sweet was that David actually put a character named Gary into this story. He's a pretty minor side character, but he's written to be casually cool, a great athlete, and a good boyfriend, which I think actually reflects David's view of who he believes Gary to be. Now, obviously he doesn't see Gary as his boyfriend, but Gary has always been the definitive leader of the group, so it would make sense for some of the others to look up to him, to see him as loyal and kind and cool. I thought it was a really nice homage from David, especially as this is Gary's birthday gift. But once again, I'm not going to let the overarch affect the score or anything like that. It was just a few observations that I thought added some really good moments to this episode. This story is about a boy named Keith who was recently in a car crash. It messed up his leg really bad, and while he'll always walk with a limp from now on, the worst damage was actually done to his self-confidence. He sees himself as broken and kind of worthless, and his leg is a constant reminder that he'll never be who he used to be. In this intro scene, we meet that Gary character, and I have to point out, Gary's friend is wearing a shirt that we've seen before. He's literally wearing the same shirt that Chris had on in The Tale of Locker 22. We've already got one of those shirts in our 90s fashion closet, but I don't see why we can't add another. This episode focuses on a bit of a love triangle. Keith likes a girl named Shelly, even though she's got a boyfriend, and Keith's friend Mariah has a crush on him. Throughout the episode, Mariah is way too kind to Keith. He treats her really poorly, always being passive-aggressive and oddly dismissive of her. But she just loves him and takes it over and over. In fact, it never changes her view of him, even though he is pretty rude to her at times. So, a school dance is coming up, and Keith really wants to ask Shelly, but he doesn't have the confidence. Lucky for him, he reads an ad in a comic book telling him of a magic shop where he can buy a potion that will bring the best out of people and will give him the confidence that he so desires. He goes to the shop, and here we see the man himself, Mr. Sardo.
Is there a Mr. Sourdough here?
That's sourdough!
No, mister. Accent on the dough.
Every time this guy shows up, we know that we're in for a treat of misunderstood magic. It's good to see that he somehow escaped the crystal ball that he was trapped in. I hope Weeds and Mary Beth got out as well. Sardo finds the potion and sells it to Keith, but he warns him to only ever take 1 drop at a time. I also love how every time we see Sardo, he tries to bargain for his wares, but he gets lowballed every time because he's dealing with kids who just, they don't have any money.
How much does it cost?
Well, it's very
very difficult to put a value on just what this will do for you, but if I were pressed, I'd say $40?
$40?
All right, 35, but I'm losing on the deal.
Thanks just the same.
How much you got?
$20.
Done. I'll get your receipt.
Before Keith leaves, he tries the potion on Sardo's rabbit and sees the rabbit become all cute right before his eyes. But after he leaves, smoke rises from the rabbit's cage, and we see that everything is not as it seems. We got monsters, folks! Keith goes home and uses the potion right away, and he's magically transformed into cool Keith. You can tell he's cool because he wears a leather jacket now. Also, he doesn't have a limp, so the potion healed his injury, which, actually that is pretty cool. He heads out straight away and starts to rizz up Shelly, saying that he's Keith's cousin KC, who is visiting from out of town. The next morning, Keith wakes up to find that he's reverted back into the limping, lame version of himself, but to make things even worse, he's started to get hairy boils on his chest. A little bit later, he notices the grossness is spreading to his hands, so he throws away the potion for like 10 seconds. You see, Shelly calls him and invites KC on a date, so of course, Keith goes back for the potion and he becomes his cool self. This works really well for him as the date goes perfectly and he and Shelly share in a kiss. He then asks her to the school dance, and she agrees to go with him, so KC will have to make at least one more appearance the next night. This time, when Keith wakes up, the grossness has spread to his face and neck, and his teeth have become jagged and monstrous. He ditches school and goes back to Sardo for some help, but in classic Sardo fashion, he has no idea what's going on.
I must admit, it is a bit unusual.
Sardo missed a page in his book that magically told of a warning for the potion.
Before bringing out the best, one must fight the dark dragon from within.
Funny, I didn't notice that.
What's the dark dragon?
I'm sure I don't know.
So Keith goes home with no idea what to do as his transformation starts to get worse. At one point, he's gone full on ghoul, and his monster design is so creepy, it looks great. Mariah comes over to check on Keith, but as usual, he just yells at her to go away, and then he just angry screams at the heavens. But despite the obvious downsides, the dance is tonight and Shelly is waiting. So Keith sneaks out and uses the potion one more time. However, Mariah trails him and watches him transform, and then put the potion into his locker. She waits until he's gone out of sight, and she sneaks up and steals the potion before downing it all in one gulp. The dance is a fine scene. Nothing much happens until Gary, who is Shelly's boyfriend, gets up on stage and tells her that he misses her, and he ends up winning her back just like that. So Keith is left without a date at the dance. That is, until the now confident Mariah saunters in, and she just straight up confesses her love for him.
I can never tell you this before, but I love you.
She just says it right out. That might be the most wild part of this whole episode. Immediately, I love you. And then right after that confession, Mariah starts to feel awful, and Keith takes her out to the hallway as she begins to transform from beauty to beast. And I've got some really mixed feelings about this part of the episode. Part of me loves it. You see, Keith speaks with Mariah, telling her about all of his insecurities. He tells her that he's hated himself ever since the accident. It's a really great confession and an honest representation of some mental health issues. I didn't expect this sort of thing popping up in this episode, and I really loved that they tackled such a heavy subject within the series. Mariah tells him that she loves him and that the accident doesn't define him, and with that, she's just fine now. She's back to beautiful, and this is where those mixed feelings come in, because as much as I loved that scene, it ends up being weirdly anticlimactic. Things are going really bad for about 30 seconds, and then everything is just instantly solved. It was, unfortunately, really rushed. But now that they're beautiful, Keith realizes that the dark dragon he needed to face were those feelings that he'd been holding against himself since the accident. He and Mariah walk off, and they live happily and beautifully ever after. Despite my mixed feelings on that final scene, I still did really enjoy this episode. I'm always going to be a fan of fantasy horror, so mixing potions with body transformations and then monsters and ghouls, it's a winner in my book. The story was solid, with some good messages on loving yourself, although some bad messages on being okay with your friends treating you poorly, and then just confessing your love to them when you get the chance. It had some great moments, but I can't get over some of the poorly written moments as well, especially that ending. It was, like I said, just rushed. So I'm gonna go with a middle of the line 5 out of 10. I did appreciate a lot of the horror in this episode. It's the first time in this series that we've gotten a little taste of body horror. Keith and Mariah being transformed into ghoulish versions of themselves, and Keith and that rabbit being straight up turned into monsters was pretty scary and really fun. I think the monster version of Keith would have scared me so bad as a kid. But those monstrous moments were really the only scary things of the episode. So for that body horror and the monster rabbit and the ghoul Keith, I'm gonna go with a 6 out of 10. For bonus points, you already know we're giving one to Sardo. I love him, and he comes back strong and just plain perfect in this episode. And I'll give another for the analogy of the Dark Dragon being a nod to self-hatred and self-doubt. It's a good lesson that a lot of people should be reminded of. So, a total of 2 out of 5 bonus points, which leaves the tale of the Dark Dragon with a total score of 13 out of 25. Happy birthday, Gary! It was an alright episode. Episode 7 is another one for Kristen. That's right, with 7 episodes, almost half of them are her stories, which I'm not complaining about at all. I love when it's Kristen's turn, because we know that we're about to get a story that is unique and interesting and all around memorable. And this episode is no exception. In fact, it's one that I know a lot of people out there remember, because this is the tale of the frozen ghost. The story starts off with none other than Sabrina the Teenage Witch. She's not a witch in this episode, but we do deal with some crazy aunts and some supernatural elements, so weirdly enough it fits. Sabrina is babysitting a boy named Charles, whose parents are incredibly rich and have raised him to be a little bit afraid of everything, including small things like getting dirty. He's a little bit strange, and we can tell that Sabrina's getting tired of dealing with his antics. They arrive at Charles's aunt's house, but like I mentioned, they're a bit strange, and their house is also a little bit creepy.
Whoa, Spooksville or what?
Despite them being strange, the aunts are really accommodating and nice. They're thrilled to have Charles come visit, and they treat Sabrina with a really warm welcome. Although, as they're helping their guests to their room, one of them lets something slip out about ghosts, and Charles, he just doesn't handle this news well.
Dear, I only said hosts, not ghosts.
Ghosts?
Silly me. My hearing isn't what it used to be.
Ghosts?
It's pretty funny because ghosts are brought up a few times in this episode, and pretty much every time Charles does this same reaction. His buggy eyes and the way that he says ghosts all terrified, it made me laugh each time. He did a great job. In the night, Charles has a nightmare of a man who seems to be hunting him down. The dream is quick, but we see the point of view of someone hiding in a log as this man takes away his jacket. Charles wakes up as his bedroom window bursts open, and he looks outside to see that the ghost his aunts had mentioned is real, and not only that, but it repeats one of the most well-known phrases in this entire series. Seriously, each time you bring up "Are you afraid of the dark?" I'd say there's like a 40% chance that someone will just reply with, "I'm cold." Like, this is where it all started. It's such a memorable voice line. Charles runs from his room to tell Sabrina what happened, and this brings me to something that I love in this episode. I haven't talked a lot about plain cinematography in this series yet, but in the tale of the frozen ghost, there are so many weird moments and bits of camera work that I have to give a nod to. First off, As Charles runs to tell Sabrina about the ghost, it's fast forwarded and he bumbles around and spins in a panic. It's so funny and weird, but it gets its point across that, Charles is really panicking right now. Another moment is right after he tells Sabrina. She doesn't believe him, and it just does a really funny sudden jump cut to Charles getting the door slammed in his face. A little bit later, there's also an interesting point of view shot as Charles searches the nearby woods, and then there's this really cool tilted camera angle at one point when Charles gets spooked. And then the last part that really got me was this weird double take fall into a mud puddle that happens a little bit later. I like this episode a lot, and the camera work and weird cinematography choices really ended up elevating it for me. I had to mention that, but now we can get back to the story. Well, sort of, because there's a few things that I need to mention about the aunts really quick as well. First off, they're pretty poor. They own this house, but it's in really bad disrepair. The electricity has gone out because they couldn't pay their bills, and their wood-burning stove constantly smokes out the rooms because the chimney flue is stuck, and they've never been able to fix it. While Charles's family is rich, there's some familial disputing that's caused the aunts to never feel comfortable about asking his family for any sort of money or help. The dispute happened when their ancestor hired a criminal bank robber to work on his farm. This robber ended up getting caught while in their employment and was taken away to prison. Although, the train he was on crashed, and everyone on board apparently died. And finally, the aunts know about the ghost. They've seen him many times and have put together that he was a boy that used to live on their neighbor's farm a few generations ago. But he's never spoken to them before, and whenever they get close, he disappears. Oh, also, one aunt is doing some needlework of a bloody axe, and it's got nothing to do with anything, but I had to point it out because it's weird and a little bit creepy. Sabrina and Charles head outside to gather some more firewood, and as they're doing so, they hear that memorable line again coming from the nearby tree line. Sabrina goes to investigate, leaving Charles alone. But he isn't alone for long. In the mud, he notices footsteps beginning to appear, moving closer to him, and when he turns around to run, the ghost boy is there. Charles runs off into the woods, but the ghost boy cuts him off constantly, repeating over and over that he's cold. This is where that double take of Charles falling into the mud puddle happens. Sabrina finds him and helps him out of the mud, but they both freeze as the ghost is there staring at them. It says again that it's cold, before pointing to a hollow log, the same one that Charles dreamt about the night before. He realizes then what his dream must have meant, and searching the log, he finds the ghost boy's jacket. He returns the jacket to the boy, warming him up and allowing the ghost to finally move on. Also, inside the log, they find an odd-looking key, and showing it to the aunts, they realize that this is the key that opens up the chimney flue. They open the flue, only to see hundreds of gold coins come spilling through their stove. So, in the span of just a day or two, Sabrina and Charles helped the ghost move on and solved all of the aunts' money problems. And that's the end. For a little bit of cleanup on the story, in case you haven't put all the pieces together, the Midnight Society members do all of that for us at the close of the episode. They realize that the criminal bank robber guy hid all of his stolen goods inside of the stove, but the neighbor boy must have seen him, so the criminal hunted the boy down and stole his jacket before leaving him stranded in the woods. Like, it's pretty basic, but it was a fun little way of tying up some small details that could have gone under the radar for some of the younger viewers. This was another absolutely killer episode from Kristen, and I'm happy to say that I think this is also the scariest story that she's told so far. I like that the story itself was left with a tiny bit of ambiguity that let the viewers put the pieces together for themselves. I know that the Midnight Society kids did that for us at the end of the episode, but they kind of represent the audience as they were also listening to the story and putting all the clues together. So that's a definite positive for me. It did a good job of setting up a few different problems throughout the story as well. The aunt's money problems, the fact that Charles is a bit of a wuss, and Sabrina thinking Charles is a weirdo. And then it solved each of those problems with character moments and literal gold so fluidly as the story was told. I think the aunts were interesting characters, the mystery of the ghost boy was layered in fun family lore, and Charles's character arc forcing him to face his fears was really well done. It did have a few little issues like the pacing and relying on that dream to solve the mystery, even though we only saw the dream for like 2 seconds and never really got a clear view of what was happening. But even with those little negatives, I think this story deserves a 7 out of 10. And like I said, it's also probably Kristen's scariest story. The ghost kid is pretty haunting, and I loved the little jump scares that we got as it popped up behind Charles constantly. The aunts added a bit to the scares as well, as they were strange and off-putting. I was expecting them to try and eat the kids by the end of the story. And I think the scariest part was those footprints that appeared in the mud. It was shot really well and was quite spooky. It's not the scariest episode that we've seen so far, but for Kristen, it was her peak horror, and I'm gonna give it a 6 out of 10. For a few bonus points, I'm giving 2 for the really fun camera work. It stuck out a lot to me, so I've got to reward it. And I'll give another to the famous voice lines. It'll stick in your head and you'll repeat it even 30 years later. So 3 out of 5 bonus points, which leaves the Tale of the Frozen Ghost with a total score of 16 out of 25. And keeping Kristen as one of my absolute favorite storytellers in this entire series. And now we get to hear from the horror expert of this series as Betty Ann is taking the storyteller's seat. 2 kids named Claire and Andrew are on a road trip with their babysitter Louise. They just spent the day at an amusement park, and in a really quick and kind of quiet line, we hear Andrew talk about his favorite part of the park.
Oh, the laugh in the dark ride was awesome. When Zebo jumped out, I almost croaked.
So childish.
I love this kind of thing. As the episodes get more and more established and the seasons go on, we see more and more callbacks to previous episodes. So far, the only other one that I've caught was the possible Bostic mention, but I'll keep pointing them out whenever I see them. As they're making their way to the highway, we see the road sign has been switched out, and they're pointed in a completely opposite direction. After a while, they come across a tavern called the Whisper Inn, and since they are good and lost now, they go inside to hopefully get some directions. Inside, they meet a man who calls himself Master Raymond, and I love how he's dressed. Initially, it looks like he's in a skeleton costume, but as he steps into the light, we see that it's really just a fancy suit with rib-like silver decorations. It's such a fun costume and lets us know right away that everything isn't as it appears to be when Master Raymond is involved. Also, he's got a big ol' ring on, and that's important. He gives the trio some directions and they leave the tavern, but we see as he maniacally laughs once they're outside of the building. Something that I need to mention about this interaction is the fact that Master Raymond says that he hates the wind. When the door opens, a breeze comes in and he gets all freaked out for a minute. And then we see this happen again when Andrew pulls out his little fan toy. They don't do a great job of, subtly letting us know these things. It's kind of shoehorned in and very obvious that it's going to be important for later on. So they follow the directions that Raymond gave, only to come across a mansion, and the second they get near it, the car dies. Louise decides to go inside the mansion to use the phone while leaving the kids in the car, and as she approaches the door, it opens by itself. A decent amount of time later, the kids realize that Louise has been in there for way too long. So they go in after her to see what's going on, and then once again, the door opens by itself. This mansion is so cool. It's clearly a play on the Haunted Mansion in the Magic Kingdom, as it itself turns out to be also a haunted mansion, but there's a few things that we'll see later on that really cement this as its influence. As the kids check the mansion, they find a long, stretching hallway that's covered in picture frames that have no pictures in them. This whole time, creepy music box music is playing, and as the kids near a room, they find what seems to be a banana split party set up just for them. They fight over a banana split, but fortunately for them, neither of them eat it because once they spill on the ground, smoke plumes from the ice cream, and an image of Master Raymond appears and seems to try and enter the room through the smoke. I love how his hand wraps around the edges of the smoke here. It's some decently done effects, and it added a good scare to an otherwise already pretty scary moment. The kids run out of the mansion and decide to go to the Whisper Inn for help. At this point, they don't know that Master Raymond was the guy in the smoke, but we do because it's pretty obvious. However, when they get to the inn, Raymond isn't there. Inside, there's a few people who all act strange and look as if they're each from a different time period. There's one dude that just reminded me of Jim Carrey in this scene. The way he walks and talks and even like bobs his head. I'm pretty sure he was trying to do an impression, but I'm not positive.
Who lives in that house?
Better question is, who's the house living in?
And I also need to point out the music here. They play an old jukebox, and you can hear the theme song for the show in an old-timey style.
So sad. So sad.
Pay no attention. They're just pulling your leg.
It's so cool. The things they do with the theme in some episodes always stands out to me. The only really important thing that this scene gives us is this lady who says that Claire reminds her of her dead daughter. But after saying that, the kids leave, only to realize that they didn't ask about a phone, and when they come back, the inn is suddenly completely empty. So now, with no phone and no help, the kids realize that it's up to them to take matters into their own hands and try to save Louise. They head back to the mansion and hear Louise calling to them. When they enter the den, they see her in the reflection of a mirror, only to have Master Raymond take over a moment later. They go back upstairs, and this time, as they walk past the empty frames, we see the ghostly images of each of the people that we met before coming to life inside. It's creepy, and this is definitely what feels the most like the Haunted Mansion to me. They can hear Louise humming from a nearby room, and inside they see her rocking a baby. But on her finger is a large ring, the same one that Master Raymond was wearing when they first met him. Louise begins to suddenly talk with Raymond's voice, and she throws the baby at Claire, only now it's transformed into a freaking snake. It's some really good horror, and there's more to come. Andrew and Claire run and end up accidentally splitting up. Claire runs into a dead end where she sees a face on the wall that looks like Louise, and it begins to speak.
Help me, Louise? It's me. It's really me.
This is so cool and so scary. I freaking love it. Claire pushes on the candle holders and ends up finding a secret room that has Louise inside. Andrew follows Claire's voice, and she tells him about the secret passage, but when he tries to enter, the face of Louise morphs into this creepy Master Raymond face. But Andrew's able to just blow it away with his fan, and then he enters the secret passage. They both try to rescue Louise, but Master Raymond steps from the shadows and shows that he's got full control of their babysitter. He says that if she stays in the house until the sun goes down, that her soul will belong to him, and that he will use her life energy to keep everyone in the house alive forever. Fortunately, Andrew thinks quick and breaks a window, which lets a breeze in and dissipates Master Raymond and sets Louise free. They run from the passage, but as they near the front door, Raymond appears again, and he swipes Andrew's fan before he gets a chance to use it. He then takes control of Louise again, and this time, he also decides to take Claire.
Run along, little boy. They're mine now.
But that was his mistake. The lady ghost we met earlier steps from the shadow and realizes that Raymond wants to kill Claire. But since she reminds her of her daughter, that just won't fly. The lady opens the door, setting the girls free and releasing them from the house. They get in the car and drive away to safety. But Master Raymond will still get a victim, because we see a stranger's car arrive and break down a few minutes later. And with that, the episode ends. This episode was interesting and pretty dang scary. But I mean, what else are we supposed to expect from a Betty Ann story, you know? I think the story was pretty good, although it did have some flaws that are going to count against it. I think the plot is great with the haunted mansion and the kids that have to rescue their babysitter from an evil ghost man. but I didn't love how the ghost lady ended up saving the day in a bit of a Deus Ex Machina sort of way. I also didn't love how blatantly they made the wind as a weapon to be used against the ghost. It just didn't naturally fit into the story the way that they pointed it out and mentioned it. Like I said, it was a bit shoehorned in. Otherwise, I did enjoy this episode, and I'm gonna give it a 7 out of 10. But this episode was scary. There were some episodes in here that put me on edge. The snake baby was so rad and freaky, and the Luis face in the wall was one of those moments that just stood out to me as truly horrific. There's also everything with Master Raymond just appearing out of nowhere, and the ghosts in the picture frames, and the ice cream acid with the creepy music. It's good horror, and without a doubt this episode is an 8 out of 10. For a few bonus points, I'm definitely giving one for the music. Both the music box and the old-timey theme song were really cool. I'll give another for Master Raymond's performance. He was menacing and weird, and all around just a joy to watch. Another will go to that Luis face in the wall. I think that was my favorite part of this whole episode. Her voice coming out of that thing was, like I said, it was so rad. And I'll give a final point to the Haunted Mansion. They did a lot to make it a character itself, with the picture frames and the changing rooms, and the hallways that seemed to twist or just end in dead ends. It was a really effective place to set a horror story. So, 4 out of 5 bonus points, which leaves Betty Ann with another really great story and gives The Tale of the Whispering Walls a total score of 19 out of 25. So far in this series, we've had 2 episodes dedicated to vampires, The Tale of the Nightly Neighbors and The Tale of the Midnight Madness. But another monster that usually coincides with vampires is werewolves, a monster that we've yet to have a story about. Until now. Frank seems to have a thing for classic monsters and monster movies, because just as he revived Nosferatu, he's balancing the scales and giving us our first werewolf story with The Tale of the Full Moon. And I've got to say, this is one of the most stylized episodes that we've seen so far. Jed and his friend Huey are pet detectives, locating local lost pets in exchange for a small fee in order to save up some money so that Jed can buy himself a puppy. Their setup is pretty rad, just a small clubhouse with a sign posted out front, and they use tools like squeaky toys and dog whistles to get their cases solved. Currently, they're on the case of a missing cat, so they head out to the neighborhood searching high and low. And I've got to point out that Huey he's got straight up superpowers, because at one point he jumps right over a fence, does a flip, and grabs a lady's wig from off of her head. He thinks it's the missing cat, but dude, he just fully cleared a 6-foot fence like it was nothing. Dude, Huey is built different. Jed ends up finding the collar of the missing cat outside of his neighbor's house. He knocks, but there's no answer, so he sneaks around the back where he finds a pile of discarded collars. Through the glass door, he sees his neighbor as he reaches into the fridge and starts to prepare some kind of ground up meat. This neighbor is never given a name, by the way, so I'll just be calling him Mr. Neighbor for this episode because I'm very creative. Mr. Neighbor gets distracted with a phone call, so Jed sneaks inside and sees that the fridge is full of even more containers of ground meat. The implications being that the pile of empty collars all belong to pets that were ground up by Mr. Neighbor. Jed runs out and returns home, where he plans to continue his investigation. And now, I get to talk about the style of this episode. It's all over the place in fantastic ways. First off, the music. The intro and every time Jed is investigating, it's all old-timey detective jazz. It fits so well with the kids' banter and searching compilations. When Jed gets home, the music feels like a really played-up 50s sitcom, especially this time when they talk about Jed's dad, who's no longer in the picture. And then, walking in the same shoes as The Tale of the Whispering Walls, there's a scene where the Are You Afraid of the Dark theme song plays, but now in a little 50s style.
Honey, dinner be ready in a minute.
We're having company?
Well, yeah. Remember that guy I told you about, the one I met bowling a couple weeks ago?
He's coming here?
Mm-hmm.
You're having a date?
Oh, it's not a date, it's just dinner. It doesn't mean a thing.
But the music isn't all that sets this one apart. Just look at Jed's house and at his mom. The mom reminded me so much of the lady from Mars Attacks, which is just an overly done 50s stereotype, but also an alien. And the house is covered in random nonsense like flamingo decorations and a heel on top of a leopard printed couch, a picture of a fishbowl. They're all things that feel almost familiar, but show us that this place is a little bit unusual. Jed's also got a really cool motorcycle helmet light, which goes perfectly with that motorcycle phone from Dream Machine. And once again, I want it. Anyway, there's a lot more background stuff and music bits in this episode that are just fantastic, so keep an eye out in the scenes and let me know of any of your favorite bits that I might have missed. That night, Jed spies on his neighbor with a camera. It's another fun little stylized bit as the camera is in black and white, and the music that plays is so monster movie wonderful. He sees Mr. Neighbor clutch himself in pain before he rises back into the window, now fully transformed into a werewolf. He tells his mom, but she just shrugs it off as his recording seems to have glitched, so the rewound footage shows no neighbor or werewolf whatsoever. The next day, Huey and Jed read up on werewolves in their Shapeshifters in History book and learn that werewolves are allergic to red roses and pure silver. But they don't really have a plan on how to move forward.
But the question is, what do you do if you got a werewolf living next door?
Move.
That night, the mom has a date, and Jed is scared to find that it's with none other than Mr. Neighbor. Although he shows up to the door with a bouquet of red roses, and when Jed pokes him with his silver fork, nothing happens. So maybe he isn't a werewolf after all. I do need to point out, whatever it is that the mom cooked in this scene, none of it is identifiable. There's red, green, blue, yellow, and black. I could easily tell you what color they are, but I have no earthly idea what food any of this could be. The mom and Mr. Neighbor decide to take their date out of the house, so Jed has the idea to continue his investigation. He calls up Huey, and he's just chilling in his pink bath with a floral swim cap on next to his penguin towel. Dude, Huey's probably the coolest character in the whole series. But they decide to get together and they break into Mr. Neighbor's house. While searching around, they don't find anything interesting until Huey discovers a picture and they both realize that Mr. Neighbor has a twin brother. And they also realize that the werewolf is right behind them. The shots of the werewolf are terrifying. I love the design of the mask with the drooling mouth and the sunken eyes, and how it's dressed up in ripped up clothes. It's fantastic. They run for the front door, but it's locked up tight, so with the werewolf on their heels, they head upstairs and lock themselves in a room that's covered with chains and a ripped up mattress.
Oh man, we're in his bedroom!
After a few seconds, the werewolf breaks down the door, and I love as it enters, the classic Dracula organ song begins to play. He corners the kids, but Jed thinks quick and uses his trusty dog whistle to stun the werewolf. They make their way to the door, but are stopped when Mr. Neighbor walks into the room. And now comes the twist. It turns out that all of these stylized moments, all the strange furniture and odd behaviors, were clues that this is not the same Earth that we all know. Mr. Neighbor explains that in this world, werewolves are a known thing, and lycanthropy is seen as a very discriminated against disease.
Lycanthropy is a terrible disease. Everybody tells me I should just put him out of his misery. But he's family. It's all I got.
The mom walks in a little bit later, saying that Mr. Neighbor told her all about his twin brother and that she's willing to look past the disease. Then, We cut to a little bit of time later where Mr. Neighbor and the mom are married and living together as a family. And as for Jed, well, he finally got a brother and the dog that he's always wanted. I also love all of their matching outfits. And that's the end of this episode. I think that this episode highlights the potential of this entire series. There's so much that they are able to do with scary stories. There are no real boundaries that stop them from being creative and creating a 50s style pet detective werewolf family drama episode. It feels so unconventional, and yet it fits Are You Afraid of the Dark perfectly. I'm obviously a big fan of this episode, so let's talk about the scores. The story is a good time. The kid detective discovering a werewolf that ends up dating his mom is a bit intense, but also a good bit of humor. I love the friendship of Jed and Huey. They banter and poke at each other like real friends would. It just felt so natural. The twist is also fantastic, both Mr. Neighbor having a twin brother and the fact that the werewolf isn't really a monster, but just a misunderstood dude. And the ending is really funny and surprisingly completes Jed's arc of wanting a puppy in such a great and unexpected way. I'm gonna give this story an 8 out of 10. It was also decently scary. It didn't show any dead pets, but it's so heavily implied with all of the ground up meat and the empty collars, and ends up being pretty disturbing. Mr. Neighbor plays a great role as an untrustworthy stranger, and then everything with the werewolf was intense and straight up horrifying. Its design alone is properly monstrous. The whole episode did have an air of humor and whimsy to it that took the horror down just a notch, but when it was scary, it was really scary. So I'm going with a 7 out of 10 for the scares. Now, you know me, and by how much I've talked up certain bits of this episode, you know that it's going to get some really good bonus points. The music is incredible, so 1 point there, and I'm giving another musical point for the Are You Afraid of the Dark 50s style theme song as well as the Dracula organ bit because I loved those moments in particular. I'll give another for the werewolf design. It was scary and fun at the same time, especially at the end when it's in that matching family shirt. Another will go to the sets and the food and basically everything that had to do with the mom. There's always something to look at. Like, I could probably spend 10 minutes paused on each scene and still not see all of the goofy little details that they added just for a little bit of humor and style. And finally, I'm giving a point to Huey. He's the coolest character that we've ever seen with his superpowered jumps and chilled tub lounging vibes, so he'll get that final point, totaling our second ever full 5 out of 5 bonus point score and giving The Tale of the Full Moon an incredible 20 out of 25. Hats off to you, Frank. This episode was a banger. I know that a lot of people are going to be excited for this next episode because it's probably the one that I've received the most comments about. Either this one or Dead Man's Float, but that isn't for another couple of seasons. This is the tale of the shiny red bicycle, and there's a reason that it sticks out to so many people. It's an episode told by David, and it's very unlike anything that we've seen so far. We've dealt with monsters and aliens, with other dimensions and killer clowns. We've even dealt with the fear of being lost and growing old. But this episode feels like a glimpse into life, into tragedy, into loss. It's the most serious episode that we've seen so far, maybe even the most serious episode in the entire series. It starts with two best friends named Mike and Ricky. Ricky was known for always riding around on his shiny red bicycle. But one day, the two friends were riding on a bridge over a river just as a man is diverting the stream. This causes the river to rise and become more wild, which shakes the bridge and causes Ricky to stumble against the railing. The railing then fails, and Ricky and his bike fall. Mike tries to catch his friend, but there's nothing he can do but watch as he's swept into the water and killed. Yeah, this is just the intro. There's probably not going to be a whole lot of jokes in the breakdown of this episode. The majority of this story takes place 5 years later as Mike wakes up from his reoccurring nightmare. He's clearly got PTSD, he blames himself for failing to save his friend, and he never even got closure as Ricky's body and even his bicycle were never found.
Well, for one thing, you could stop blaming yourself for Ricky's death.
But something is different today. The nightmare felt real, and at school, Mike starts seeing hints of his old friend. First seeing his red bicycle on the bike rack, and then seeing his ghostly appearance in the doorway of his class. He's sent to the nurse as it seems like Mike had some kind of an episode, but the appearances don't stop, as outside the window he sees Ricky call to him before disappearing, and when Mike turns around, Ricky's ghost has replaced the nurse. On his way home from school, Mike thinks he sees Ricky again, and forces his dad to stop the bike rider, only to find that it's just a little girl, which makes his dad think that Mike's PTSD is just getting worse, and he's starting to see things that could never actually be there. Something that I need to highlight in this episode are all of the actors. Every single one of them, from Mike to his parents, to the small appearances from the nurse, act their hearts out. This story is super serious, so if the acting felt campy or off, it probably wouldn't have had the same impact. But it feels pretty real. The family jokes around and occasionally butt heads, the younger brother Ben looks up to Mike, and they share a few roughhousing moments here and there. And even the teachers, and like I mentioned the nurse, just felt to me like really solid interpretations of some of the teachers and nurses that I had or met in high school. It adds to the serious tone by making this world feel as real as possible, and I think that that's a big part of the reason why people remember this episode. Not to mention, they handled the idea of Mike's PTSD perfectly. It's not taken lightly at all, but there is a little bit of frustration that shows from his parents, as they know all they can do is try and talk their son out of his growing guilt, but ultimately, they're powerless to help. So, tomorrow is the start of the fishing season, and Ben and Mike have a tradition to go fishing at the river every year. But this year, Mike has been put on bed rest by the doctor, so he won't be able to go. The next day, Ben and some of his friends head off to the river, and I'll say it, Ben's friends suck, and he needs to get new ones. First off, as they're walking, one friend says this.
Hey, isn't that where your brother's friend got killed?
Yeah, no worries about the trauma, just scream it out, you bozo. Then Ben accidentally knocks over his friend's soda, and that same freaking kid throws Ben's ball as hard as he can into the river and makes Ben go and get it. I hate this kid. At the same time, back home, Mike is woken up by the ghost of Ricky. He heads outside and is actually able to speak with his dead friend.
I tried to save you, all right? I tried. I did whatever I could. If that wasn't good enough, do whatever you want to me.
I'm not here to hurt you, Mike. You're my best friend.
Ricky tells Mike the whole reason that he's come back is because he knows that Ben is in trouble. He says that Mike needs to go right now to save his younger brother, and even offers his shiny red bicycle to Mike so that he can get there faster. It's super sweet, and it's very sad, as before Mike rides off, he and Ricky share a final few words.
I miss you, Ricky.
I miss you too, Mike.
So, Mike rides off just as we see Ben's foot get stuck between some rocks. He tries to shout for help, but the sound of the river is too loud, so his terrible friends don't hear him. Also, it's time to divert the stream again, so we see a man doing that and raising the river. Mike rides as fast as he can, freezing for just a moment when he sees the bridge where Ricky died, but forcing himself forward knowing that Ben is in trouble. He leaves the bike up on the bank and climbs down, helping Ben release his stuck foot and helping him back to the bank just as the raging river rushes in. He knows that due to Ricky, his little brother's life was saved, and looking back at the bank, he sees that the bike he rode here on is rusted and destroyed.
The very next day, a man who was fishing found the remains of Ricky Haggerty. Why had it taken so many years to find him? Mike Buckley will tell you that it's because he wasn't even down there. Not at least until he had paid back a favor to an old friend.
It's kind of crazy how polar opposite the tones of these last two episodes have been. Whereas The Tale of the Full Moon was full of whimsy, this one was serious and solemn. It's part of the beauty of this show. I can see why people remember this episode so well. It feels like a story that you'd hear in real life. In fact, for a lot of us, they aren't stories at all, but memories of lost friends or family, and this episode invokes those feelings of loss in a way that is respectful and poignant. With that being said, let's stop being so serious and let's rate the tale of the shiny red bicycle. I think the story is pretty incredible, and the only two things that I don't love are Ben's bozo friend and the dialogue when the characters are next to the river, because it's really poorly mixed and it ends up being pretty hard to hear. But them tackling PTSD so well is amazing. The dialogue of the family and all of the family dynamics feels real. The conversation between Mike and Ricky is so sweet that it gave me goosebumps. And the transformation of the bike at the end, symbolizing Mike's ability to forgive himself, was heartwarming. I'm going to give this one a 9 out of 10. It's got a few good scares, but not a ton. The ghost of Ricky had some scary moments, like when he just appears as the nurse, or when he's reaching out for Mike during one of his nightmares, but otherwise, I didn't feel like this one was a very scary episode, and I'll only be giving a 4 out of 10. I'll give it 2 bonus points for the acting since there were so many great actors in this one, another point as well for the depiction of PTSD. Doing such a heavy subject in a kids show was a risk, and I think it really paid off. And I'll give another point for that bike becoming all rusty at the end, because that visual is so haunting and incredibly impactful, so 4 out of 5 bonus points, which leaves the tale of the shiny red bicycle with a total score of 17 out of 25, and definitely makes this one of my favorite stories told by David, at least so far. Episode 11 is Gary's only story of the season. He did technically narrate Kiki's Tale of the Dream Machine, but that one still counts as Kiki's story since she's the one who wrote it. So that leaves The Tale of the Magician's Assistant as the sole story of the Midnight Society's leader. Gary had the highest average last season, and I love his focus on weird magic-y things, so I do have some high hopes for this episode, and the title alone tells me that we're in for a magical treat. A boy named Todd is looking for a job, and he answers an ad in the paper for a local magician who needs an assistant. If you recognize Todd, it's because he played Dougie in The Tale of the Twisted Claw, the one where his parents were killed off by a wish. But in this story, he's Todd, and only his dad is dead. His mom is alive and well. He heads to the magician's shack, and inside he finds all sorts of fun props and animals, but a strange, twisted stick seems to call to him. Before he can touch it, the magician, Mr. Shandu, appears.
Mr. Shandu?
Not Mr. Shandu. Shandu the Magnificent. You may call me Shandu.
Yes, sir, Mr. Shandu.
Todd gets the job right away, and he's told to clean up the shack a bit, and once again, he heads straight for the stick, only to have Shandu stop him, because the stick is actually a magic wand. And the first rule of magic pertains to a magician's wand.
Magical rule number 1. Never, ever touch another magician's wand unless he hands it to you.
Something that I have to point out in this episode are its nods to the Evil Dead. There's a couple of them that I noticed, but the first and most obvious one is what Shandu says here.
For thousands of years, Deadite sorcerers use wands like this to draw power from the earth.
Deadites are what the demons are called in Evil Dead. I'll point out another reference a little bit later, but it's kind of a spoiler, so that one's gonna have to wait. Todd works with Shandu for a few weeks as they practice their act, and Todd learns a few more rules of magic.
Magical rule number 2. Only let them see what you want them to see.
I know. Magical rule number 3.
The cardinal rule. Never, ever get caught in your own reflection.
Shandu is also a little bit strict and rude with Todd. They definitely start to bond, but the magician never fully lets his guard down. So, one day, Todd asks him why he's like this, and we get Shandu's backstory. It turns out Shandu used to be a big hit. He had movies and large performances and plenty of fame, but over the years, his limelight faded.
It isn't very pleasant being a has-been.
The day of their first performance finally arrives, and Todd and Shandu wow the audience of a kid's birthday party. And later Shandu says that Todd is not the worst assistant in the world, so they'll keep performing together. Todd comes by the shack the next day, only to find it is a complete wreck. One of the ducks got out of its cage and knocked over everything, and let out a few other animals, and Shandu isn't around, so Todd decides it's time to test out this magic wand. He gives it a wave, and abracadabra, the shack is spotless.
No wonder he didn't want me to touch it. It's really magic.
He heads back home only to find his mom is incredibly stressed out. It turns out that she's an animator and has been asked to complete a full new project by the next morning. She's incredibly overworked, so Todd decides if anyone in the world deserved a little bit of magical help, it was his mom. He goes back and snatches the wand from Shandu, then returns home and expecto patronums his mom's art project to completion. But then, a figure appears in front of him. She calls herself Nazarak, the spirit of the wand, and she gives Todd her blessing to use the magic of the wand as much as he wants. But Todd is a good little boy. I mean, he steals, but he decides to unsteal. He returns to Shandu to return the wand, but this time he gets caught, and he's messed up big time, because it turns out that Nazarak is no good.
Nazarak is a demon.
I didn't know.
If Nazarak is released, it could mean a return to the Dark Ages for all humanity. Get out.
But...
Get out.
Yeah, so Nazarak is a shape-shifting demon who will do anything to get out of the prison in the vortex. Shandu kicks Todd out, but after a few seconds Todd decides that he doesn't want to ruin his relationship with the wizard, so he returns only to find that the shack is now on fire. And then, hearing Shandu scream for help, Todd rushes to the wand and uses its magic to quench the flames. But as the rescued Shandu walks towards him, Todd discovers he's messed up again, even worse this time.
Them to see.
Nazarak was able to swap his place with Shandu's in the prison vortex, but now the demon wants the wand. Todd runs away and rushes home to get help from his mom, only to quickly realize that Nazarak has disguised himself once again. This is the other Evil Dead reference that I noticed. The way that his mom gets all demoned out and raised into the air, it's so similar to Cheryl's transformation in The Evil Dead. She even starts to talk with demon voice. Like, I freaking loved it.
Hey, Doc.
Todd thinks he's screwed until Shandu speaks with him from the vortex and reminds him to use the rules of magic. He offers Nazarak a deal since the first rule makes it so that Todd will have to hand the wand over to him willingly. And I just love how Nazarak slides into the scene here. It's so creepy and smooth, just him appearing from the shadows. It's so great. He hands the demon the wand, but is able to position himself in front of a mirror, using the second rule to only reveal what he wants the demon to see. Then, when Nazarak tries to use a spell on Todd, he jumps out of the way, causing the demon to zap his reflection, which Rule 3 warned very heavily against. Shandu is released from the vortex and finally decides that Todd is a worthy guardian of the wand. He passes it over and promises to always be near Todd to guide him before telling him one final rule.
For now, I'll leave you with just one more rule. Magic rule number 4. Always leave them wanting more.
With that, Shandu disappears and the episode ends. I never thought I'd say it, but I'm a bit disappointed in this episode. I think it's Gary's worst story so far. Plus, we're coming off of like 4 incredible episodes in a row, so I think my expectations were a little bit high, and this one just didn't reach them. I didn't hate it, but I definitely didn't love it either. The story is pretty alright, but the pacing is really, really fast and a little bit strange. They spend a lot of time setting up Todd and Shandu to be friends, at least half of the episode, and then they don't even introduce the fact that magic is real until the second half. By the time Nazarak is even mentioned, there's only a few minutes left in the episode. I wish we got a little bit more setup for the demon and a bit more fun with magic. I do love the Todd and Shandu stuff, but it was too much for all the other stuff that they needed to end up cramming into the second half. The rules aspect is pretty good. The way that Nazarak is defeated is also pretty good. Shandu's passing of the torch and disappearing was pretty awesome, but the first half needed some sprucing up. So for the story, I'm giving this one a 5 out of 10. The scares were also pretty disappointing. Nazarak is the scary part of this episode. Everything that he does is pretty creepy. The way that he moves and talks is perfect for a demon, and his reveals of being both Shandu and Todd's moms are really great horror moments. But when he's not in there, there's just no scares. So that means that the first half is completely void of all horror, and the second half is really spotty with the scary moments. Todd's demon mom and the initial Nazarak reveal are really good, but even with those moments, I think this one only scores a 4 out of 10. However, I do love some magic, so there will be a couple of bonus points. The easiest point goes to the Evil Dead references with the Deadites and Todd's demon mom. Anything that reminds me of those movies is a winner in my book. And another will go to Shandu. The actor who played him did a really great job, and he covered emotions super well. He did everything from strict to somber, and it really brought that character alive. So 2 out of 5 bonus points, which leaves The Tale of the Magician's Assistant with a pretty sad score of 11 out of 25. With episode 11, David gets another story, and this one is called The Tale of the Hatching. Most of David's stories in this season have themes that match with events in his real life, and this is no exception as David has recently swapped to a new school. So in this story, a brother and a sister named Augie and Jazz are also starting at a new school. I love what Jazz is wearing on her first day. It belongs in the 90s fashion closet for sure, with its floral yet rainbow yet golden sheen blouse and circular sunglasses. It's a total vibe and probably my favorite fit that we've added to the closet so far. So this place is a boarding school, and the kids will live here since their parents need to travel for a few months due to their work. The school is a little bit strange, and the principal and assistant principal are a married couple named Mr. and Mrs. Taylor. The weirdest thing about this place is their bells. Instead of loud and high-pitched chimes, they're replaced with low, droning lulls.
What's that?
Class change.
We see that all kinds of high-pitched chimes are a big no-no in this place. When Augie's watch alarm goes off, Mr. Taylor grabs his head and claims that he's suffering from migraines, and we see him take away a kid's Game Boy at one point, and when Augie pulls out his portable stereo, his school friend treats it like it's full-on contraband, so there's something strange with sound in this place. Another big oddity is with a dessert that's served at every meal. It's a white goopy mess that the other kids seem to just love.
Doesn't look so hot, but it's good.
Despite how the others vouch for it, Augie and Jazz don't eat the stuff. It just looks too gross. After a couple of weeks at this school, something changes. A chime plays in the middle of the night, and all of the kids get out of bed in a trance-like state. Augie and Jazz are somehow unaffected. Everything in this sequence is so rad. All the kids are walking down to the basement in this weird, hypnotized state. The camera angles are always crooked and offset. The lighting is covered with this really atmospheric green. And the music is... man, I don't even know how to really describe it. Just give it a listen. It's so strange, but it adds to the mystery of whatever might be going on. Augie and Jazz follow the other kids to this room covered in pools of water that each have dozens of eggs floating inside. They watch as the other kids start to press buttons and pull levers, while others go down to the pools and spread some kind of salt over each of the eggs. After a minute, Mr. and Mrs. Taylor come down to watch the kids. Augie and Jazz pretend to be hypnotized, and they hear them mention that the weird goop dessert is the reason for this odd trance. Then they leave, and Augie and Jazz follow them. And now it's time for the twisty parts, but also it's time for us to get a couple of answers to the question of what's going on. The kids overhear the Taylors mention something about their master before Mr. Taylor rolls up his sleeve and shows that he's got a green, scaly arm.
Toast to our troubled past and our glorious future.
To the master.
Augie and Jazz decide it's time to skedaddle. They split up to pack up their things, but as Augie is going down to the girls' dorm to get his sister, Mrs. Taylor shows up holding Jazz hostage.
You're a monster.
Really? I haven't seen anything yet.
Jazz is able to bite the lizard lady to escape, but Mr. Taylor cuts them off and forces them to flee deep into the basement. They go into some kind of tunnel, but they stop when they hear growling coming from close ahead. They try to turn around to run, but then lights pop on, and Mr. and Mrs. Taylor are there and have locked them inside. And now they begin to monologue. They mention that they are the only two survivors from some long-lost race of lizard people, but they've been working with their master, who is a breeder of some kind. The master laid a bunch of eggs which are just about to hatch, and when they do, they'll eat all of the students in the school before rising up and taking over the whole world. They've got some good ambitions, that's for sure.
You're very lucky. You get to meet the mother.
The growling starts up again from the end of the tunnel, and a giant monster lizard creature crawls out. It's really cool looking, but we don't get to see it for very long. Mostly it's just silhouetted, but we do get a decent look at its head in the light at one point. But Augie thinks really quick, and he pulls out his stereo, putting the pieces together that high-frequency sound must be the lizard's weakness. He plays a song on full blast, and then Dude, the lizard freaking exploded. and that's not all. They turn around to find the Taylors also exploded, and I love how it just leaves behind their clothes in a pile of goop. It's a nice little touch. The kids return to find all the other students have come out of their trance, and also I guess the music somehow reached far out because all of the eggs have also exploded. Well, not all of them, as one remains and begins to wobble before it starts to hatch.
The end. Where is it?
I thought this episode was okay. It's not my favorite, but it had some interesting parts and some cool ideas. I just don't think it delivered on much of what it set up. The story is pretty middle of the line for me. I think Augie and Jazz played siblings really well, and I did love the mystery of the eggs showing up in the basement, and then the reveal of the lizard people was cool, but I think the end was so rushed and anticlimactic that it sort of just ruined all of the work they did to set it up. Also, I'm not sure why we didn't get a good look at the mother monster. It seemed like a little bit of a waste of their prop. Maybe it just didn't look really good, so they masked it with shadows, but I would have loved to get a decent look at this thing. With all that said, I'm gonna give the story a 4 out of 10. I also didn't find this one very scary. The reveal of the lizard people was a bit creepy, and Mr. and Mrs. Taylor played decent antagonists and made their chase scenes pretty intense. The growling of the creature was also a little scary, but the monster reveal, or lack thereof, sort of took the tension and fright out of whatever the monster was. And then, just as it was building and scares, it explodes, so nothing could really linger. I'm gonna give the scares a 3 out of 10. I will give it a few bonus points though. One for that scene of all the kids hypnotized going down to the basement. The music and the lighting was so perfectly atmospheric there, so it definitely deserves a point. I'll give another for the small glimpses of the scales that we see on Mr. and Mrs. Taylor. We didn't see them a whole lot, but each time we did, they looked really great. And I love the way that we see that their skin is actually their disguise. It was pretty well done. So that's gonna be 2 out of 5 bonus points, which leaves the tale of the hatching with a total score of 9 out of 25. From the highs of the shiny red bike to the lows of the hatching, I think David's stories are definitely the most polarizing for me. The final story of the season is told by Kiki, and it's called The Tale of Old Man Corcoran. This one does quite a lot with the time that it's given, and the story is pretty compact but decently well told. It starts with two brothers named Jack and Kenny, who just moved into a new neighborhood. They're looking for ways to make friends and to fit in, and just the opportunity arrives when a group of friends all ride up and invite the brothers to a game of hide and seek. Jack is a little bit older, so he thinks that hide and seek is just a kid's game, but he's easily goaded in by the lead boy Marshall when he mentions that Jack must just be scared.
What does he mean, unless you're afraid? I don't know. It's a kid's game, right? What's so scary about hide and seek?
Well, it turns out that the game will be played in a graveyard. I will say, as far as settings go, we've had a few different graveyard episodes take place, but this is the first time when the setting alone really does feel spooky. It's really dark, the headstones are a little bit ski-wampus, there's usually fog drifting around the ground, and the music they play is subtle but perfectly atmospheric. I'd definitely be afraid to play here when I was a kid. They meet Marshall that night, and it's pretty cool and kind of creepy how he calls all of the others out of their hiding spots. They each rise from behind gravestones in the shadows. It's a great little spook.
Hope you don't scare easy.
What's there to be scared about? It's just a graveyard. Everyone's dead here.
Well, kinda.
What are you talking about?
You didn't tell him the legend of Old Man Corcoran.
The legend of who?
He was a gravekeeper that used to live here and dug all the graves by hand. He was known for playing his harmonica, but he was also really protective of the graves, and whenever he caught a kid trying to sneak around the graveyard, he'd catch them and cut off their hands with his axe. But rumor is that if you listen carefully, you can still hear the sounds of his harmonica playing from somewhere in the tree line. And with that, a seeker is chosen, and everyone splits up to go and hide. As they're searching for spots, Jack and Kenny hear the sounds of a harmonica playing from not too far away. They sneak close and see an old cabin with a stump that has a harmonica sitting on top. They run away, but are spotted by the seeker, and in their panic they try to run to the safe zone, only to bump right into an old man holding an axe. They run away from the graveyard, and the next day their new friends all show up to their house and invite them to finish their game of hide and seek. Also, Jack and Kenny have this really cool Bart Simpson skateboard. I would have loved this kind of thing as a kid, but nowadays I'd probably just fall off and break something within the first few minutes of even thinking about hopping on a skateboard. At least I could still dream about having clap lights. It won't, those won't hurt me. The boys try to tell the others about the old man that they saw, but none of them believe them, and then just like the night before, the friends call them chickens and end up goading them into agreeing to come by the graveyard again that night to finish off their game. Since the brothers were the ones who left early the night before, they're chosen now to be the seekers. They count while the others go and hide, and then they start their hunt. But it's strange, as every time they think that they see someone, they disappear. Then they hear the harmonica again, and Jack decides that they need to go and steal Old Man Corcoran's harmonica to prove to the others that he's real. They sneak into the cabin, and there's a few scenes here that were really scary. I love this part when Jack bumps into an old music thingy, and then spins in a circle while staring at all of the spooky stuff in the cabin while the music builds and warps. But the best part happens when Kenny finds the harmonica and hands it to Jack. But look at how Jack hands over his flashlight. He thinks that he's giving it to Kenny, but someone in the darkness actually takes it and makes it look like the light is just floating there. And then Corcoran makes another appearance.
Give me my harmonica.
That's such a great scene and such a great scare. I watched it a few times because I loved how well it's done, and it is done really well. It's so smooth and so creepy, and then that reveal and that jump scare, it's a perfect horror moment. Obviously, the boys run away only to fall into an open grave. One of the hiders was hiding in there, and she tells them to leave since this is her spot. The boys then notice that all the kids are oddly enough hiding inside of open graves, but they can't linger on why for too long as Corcoran catches them and asks the boys what they're doing here. They tell him that they're playing hide and seek.
Just the two of you.
Kenny says that it's not just them and starts to name off all of their new friends, but Corcoran knows these names.
That ain't very funny. All those kids are dead and buried. I dug the graves myself.
They turn around to see the open graves are now covered, and headstones have appeared over each of them, showing names and pictures of their ghostly friends.
The end. So, does anyone want to play the dumb kids game again?
I think that this was a pretty good episode to end the season with. It's not the best in the season, but it was pretty fun and quite scary, and it had a really great twist. The story is pretty clever, and I loved knowing the twist while watching this one and seeing all the little hints that the kids are dead this whole time. There's actually quite a bit of clues that we get that shows us the ending if you know what to look for. It did end up making me feel a little bit sad for old man Corcoran. It seems like he's just kind of an old, lonely dude working away in a graveyard. But the scary story about him sets the scene that makes us think he's the bad guy. There was a lot going on in this one, but I did think it did a decent job of bringing everything together. That and the twist at the end will give this story a 7 out of 10. It was a little bit scary as well. It definitely had some of my favorite scares in the series so far. That flashlight scene alone, I think, is the best scare that we've had. Otherwise, the scares are a little bit more subtle as the boys linger in the graveyard. It's something that probably won't stick with you, but in the moment it does feel spooky and intense. So I'm going to give this one a 6 out of 10. For a few bonus points, I'll give 2 for those scenes in the cabin. Both the spinning scary bit and the flashlight reveal part were great, so a point for each of them. I'll also give another for that ending. It puts a whole new aspect on this episode as you realize that the ghosts were trying to get the boys to die in the graveyard so that they could add new friends to their group to play hide and seek. It's kind of dark when you think of it that way. So a 3 out of 5 bonus point score, which leaves the final episode of Season 2, The Tale of Old Man Corcoran, with a total score of 16 out of 25. This show has stayed amazing. I'm sure that with the scores and by the way that I've talked about these episodes, you can tell how much I genuinely love it. This season kept the carefree wonder that instantly dragged me back into my childhood memories. They fleshed out the characters and friendships between the Midnight Society members even more, and even showed us some of the hardships and vulnerable moments that we all as kids went through, leaving us with lessons that it's okay to lean on your friends because they'll be there for you when times are tough. It's a beautiful and important lesson to learn, and it's truly a gift that it could be given to us through this amazing show. So, let's talk about the stats and figure out the best scares and stories in this season, as well as in the series so far. First off, since Eric is gone, we can finalize his score. His average obviously won't be going up or down, so he'll end off the series with his average score of 14.5 out of 25 between the two stories that he told. It'll be interesting to see where this score lands him at the very end of the series. And now for Season 2. As with Season 1, I've kept a running total of everyone's story, scare, bonus, and total points. In this season, every kid got to tell at least one story, but Gary got the short end of the stick and only got to tell one story, the tale of the magician's assistant. I'm not counting him narrating the tale of the Dream Machine, since that was written by Kiki. It's her story, and Gary was just her mouthpiece. On the other end, both David and Kristen took control of this season, as they got to tell 3 stories each, which totaled nearly half of the episodes just for these two in this entire season. Betty Ann, Kiki, and Frank told 2 stories each, landing them all tied in the middle. My least favorite story of the season once again goes to David with the tale of the hatching, which only scored a 4 out of 10. He's won my least favorite story for each season so far, which might make you think that I'm biased against him, but I'm not, because he also won my favorite story of the season with the tale of the shiny red bicycle, which scored a 9 out of 10. The least scary story of the season goes to Kristen with the tale of Locker 22. It's a great story, it's a great episode, but it only scored a 2 out of 10 for the scares. The most horrifying story of the season once again goes to the horror queen, Betty Ann, with her story, The Tale of the Whispering Walls, which scored a pretty spooky 8 out of 10. Taking all of the points together and adding up the story, scare, and bonus points, my least favorite episode of this season goes to David with The Tale of the Hatching, which only got a total of 9 out of 25. But my absolute favorite episode goes to Frank, who scored an amazing 20 out of 25 with his Tale of the Full Moon, a story full of scares, style, and great twists. Before we calculate up the new averages, let's compare Season 1 and Season 2. Each season tied with their scores for my least favorite story, as The Tales of the Lonely Ghost and The Tales of the Hatching each received a score of 4 out of 10. But choosing between the two, I'd say that The Tale of the Hatching is overall a worse story and probably my last place so far. Likewise, The Tale of the Hungry Hounds and The Tale of the Shiny Red Bicycle each tied for my favorite story with a 9 out of 10 score. But if I had to choose between these two, I'd have to say that The Tale of the Hungry Hounds is still my favorite so far. That's not going to be a very popular answer. Don't hate me. The Shiny Red Bicycle's great. Something about The Hungry Hounds just really got me. Season 1 keeps its crown for the least scary story, with The Tale of the Captured Souls being the only one so far to score a 1 out of 10. But it will also keep its bragging rights for the scariest story, as The Tale of Laughing in the Dark is the sole 9 out of 10 on the scare so far. My least favorite episode still belongs to Season 1, with The Tale of the Lonely Ghosts 7 out of 25. Man, that's also been just such an unpopular score, but I'm sticking with it. As for my favorite episode so far, in Season 1, Eric scored the highest total with a 19 out of 25. But Season 2 took things to a whole new level. We had 2 episodes tie that 19, both being told by Betty Ann with the tales of the 13th Floor and the Tale of the Whispering Walls. But Frank swiped the place for my favorite episode with the Tale of the Full Moon's new high score of 20 out of 25. And now, let's see where everyone is placed by adding up their scores and dividing it by the number of stories that they've told so far to determine the best scary storyteller between these 2 seasons. At the end of Season 2, David is our new last place with an average score of 12 between his 5 stories. He's had 2 of my least favorite episodes so far, so it's not too surprising to see him in last place. He's followed by Kiki, who averaged a score of 14 between her 3 stories. Then, the missing man, Eric, who holds a 14.5 with 2 stories told. Kristen is next with 5 total stories, giving her a 14.8. Then Gary, dropping from first place to third, with a new average of 15 between his 3 stories. In second place, we've got Frank, totaling a score of 15.5 with 3 total stories told. And the new first place winner is the horror queen herself, Betty Ann, who averaged a 16.2 between her 5 total stories and giving her the title of the best scary storyteller in Are You Afraid of the Dark so far. With that, we can wrap up the season and can declare this meeting of the Midnight Society closed.
I declare this meeting of the Midnight Society closed. Whoever you are.
I've been absolutely loving rewatching this series, and just wanted to say thank you all so much for your kind comments and for reliving some pieces of this childhood alongside me. These videos take a lot of work to make, but seeing how much you all have enjoyed the first one made me know that it was worth every minute. If you enjoyed this video, please like and consider subscribing to help push it out through the YouTube landscape, and if you're looking for a good way to support me a little bit more, then consider joining these beautiful people and becoming a YouTube member. It's only a couple of bucks a month, but it does help me out a whole lot. So an extra thank you to Stu the Human, Super Suplex, Kurakula, Zed Suzuki, Reaver Approach, Shelly March, and Igor DaCosta. I love you all. And with that, Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye!
Give me my Monica.